Welcome back, guys, to Nuno Solutions. My name is Nuno, and in this video, I'm going to show you guys how you can relate two database tables. As an example, we already have a table called employees, and an employee works for a company, and a company can have one or many employees. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a company table, and I'm going to show you guys how you can relate tables in SQL Server using what's called foreign keys. And all foreign key really is a way for you to put a parent table record ID inside of the child table as a column. That way, when you fetch the child table, you'll have the parent record ID in there. So that way you can join the parent and the child tables together. So you can fetch the records from both tables at the same time. And I'll talk a little bit more about joins in the next video. So let's get started. The first step is going to be to create the company table. So let's create a table called companies. And we're going to give this a company ID. That'll be the record ID. So this we want not to be null. It has to be required. We also want this to be the primary key. And we also want this to auto increment starting with 1 and incrementing by 1 using an identity. The other thing we're going to add here is the company name. And we'll give that a varchar 100. And this has to be required as well. So we'll add not null to that. And as always with my tables, I always add a created date. There's other fields that you probably should add, like last update date, created by, last updated by, but in this case, we're just going to do created date. And I'm also going to add a constraint, which is going to be a default date, so we don't have to manually populate or insert this column. So we're going to go ahead and do this. You've seen this in the past videos. And that's pretty much it. We're going to highlight this create statement and execute it. And then we're going to refresh our tables directory. And now we have a company table that's created. And if I select from the companies table, you'll see that it's empty for now. So we have to insert some data into this table now. We're going to do an insert into companies. And I'm just going to create my insert statement. And now what I'm going to do is, like I showed you this before, you could drag the columns folder down to the query window and it'll automatically add the columns for you so you don't have to type them out. This is useful if you have a lot of columns and you don't want to type all of them out manually. So I'm going to call this company 1. And you know what? I'm just going to copy this and create a couple of insert statements here like this. Let's call company 2 and company 3. And we're going to highlight these and execute all 3 of them. And I spelled value wrong. It's supposed to be values. That's why it's complaining to me. So let's run that. Insert 3 companies. 1, 2, 3 rows affected. Now let's verify that the records are actually in there. So let's pull all the records from the companies table. All right, now we have the companies table, and where we have 3 companies. Company 3 has the record ID 3, company 2 has company ID 2, and company 1 has company ID 1. Okay, so the next step is we're going to add a column to the employees table. So in order for the company table and the employee table to be linked or related, we have to add the record ID from one of these tables to the other. And in this case, it makes sense to add the company ID to the employee table because an employee can only work for one company. And that also creates a one-to-many relationship from company to employees. And what I mean by that is one company can have one or many employees. So right now, the employees table does not have a column called company ID. So we're going to add that by using an alter table statement like this. And we're going to use an add company ID. And we're going to call that integer. And we're not going to mark it as not null because we can't do that right now because we already have records in there. So I executed it and I'm going to refresh the columns. And now you can see company ID is in there. So here's the thing. So right now, if I select from the employees, you can see a full list of employees. And if I pull the company ID, all the companies are null right now for every single employee. So I can actually right now, without doing anything else, just update an employee. And I'm going to do that. So let's set this employee right here, John Doe. Let's add company ID 1 to his company ID column so that we're going to relate this specific employee, John Doe, to company 1. The way you do that, we're going to use an update statement. We're going to set the company ID to company ID 1, where the emp ID or employee ID, which is his employee ID is 1, equals 1. There we go. So now if I select all the employees and we look at John's record, he should be associated with company ID 1, right? Which it is. So now I can technically pull the John record like this. Let me just copy this and say where emp ID equals 1, right? That gives me the John record, just the John record. Now, if I wanted to get the company that he works for, I have to join the table. And to do that, number one, I'm going to alias this employees table with just the word emp or E. Let's just use E. And then in the next line here, I'm going to use a statement called join. By default, if you just use join, it's the same thing as inner join. It's the same thing. It basically joins matching records using the condition that I'm going to put in this statement here. So I'm going to inner join the companies table. So I'm pulling from the employees table, and I'm going to join the companies table. I'm going to alias the companies table with just C as the alias. And this join is going to be joined on where the company ID of the company is equal to the employee company ID. So you see where this is going? So it's going to basically say, okay, let's get the employee company ID and search for a record in the companies table that we're joining for a company that has a company ID matching the employee company ID. So now let me just change this select statement. I'm going to do e.star, which gives me all the employee columns. And then I'm going to say, give me the company name column. So any column aliased with C dot pulls the record columns from the companies table. Any column with E dot pulls from the employees table. So here, I'll do it like this. It might make a little more sense if I just pull all the columns from the employees table. And now you'll see, I just want to emphasize something here. And what you'll see is that it's complaining that the created data is ambiguous and company ID is ambiguous. The reason why SQL Management Studio is complaining is because the employees table and companies table both have a column called company ID and created date. So SQL Management Studio doesn't know where to pull that data from. So we're going to just pull it from the employee table by aliasing it with an E dot. So we're basically saying we want the created date, and you see the squiggly lines kind of disappear. We want the created date from the employees table. So now if I run this select statement, you will see that we get a company ID column, which is actually being pulled from the company table. So you'll see here at the end here, you have the employee company ID, and over here, this is actually the company ID. As you can see, this first column is pulling from C, and the last column is pulling from E. So to prove it, in the employees table, we don't have company name, right? So let's add, now that we have these two tables joined, let's add company name. I'm going to pull it from the company table. So we have the alias with C dot. And you see how IntelliSense gives us the fields from the company table automatically. So we're going to select that. And now if I run this, it should run successfully. So now we have two tables that are joined and by company ID, which is all good and dandy, right? But the problem is the way that this is currently created, it would 100% work. But in the real world, if you don't use a foreign key, and I'll show you how to create a foreign key. The problem is you can have what's called an orphan record or orphan records. So I'm going to show you how to create an orphan record. Right now, we have the employee John linked to company one, but nothing stops me from going into the companies table, highlighting company one and deleting it. So now when I try to pull this data right here, the employee John with company ID 1, and I execute this statement, nothing gets returned. Why does nothing get returned? Very simple. Number one, the inner join joins only matching records on your join statement. So the problem here is employee ID 1 does exist. Your where clause, you're pulling employee ID 1. And employee ID 1 does exist because if I pull here, you can see John with emp ID 1 does exist. Problem is the company no longer exists because it was deleted. So this is what I'm talking about. Now you have an employee record that's an orphan, and it's an orphan record because the parent record no longer exists. So this causes a lot of issues, right? So to prevent this from happening, you use a foreign key. And a foreign key, all it basically tells SQL Server is that these two tables are related and they're dependent upon one another. And so if a foreign key is created, you won't be able to delete the parent record before deleting the child record. So let's just recreate the companies table. I'm going to delete that, right? And we're going to go back up here and we're going to recreate the table. I'm going to recreate the table and re-add the three records, the three companies. And now if I select from companies, you can see we have the three companies in there. If I refresh the tables folder, just like we did before, we now have a companies table. If I select from that, you'll see there's three companies there, company 1, 2, and 3. Now, let's add a foreign key to the employees table. So if you remember, in the employee table, we have company ID column already. You see that here? And you can see that company ID looks like a normal, if you look at the icon here, it looks just like a normal column, right? The icon is the same as all the other columns, except for this one. This one's the primary key because it has a little key icon. So let's do an alter table employees. There's a couple of ways to do this, but I'm going to show you how to do this through script first. And we're going to add a constraint, and it's going to be a foreign key. So we're going to start, the name of this constraint is going to start with FK, which is foreign key. And we're going to call this employees companies. That's going to be the name of this constraint. And now the way you add the foreign key is you actually type foreign key, and it's going to be on the company ID column. So the foreign key is going to be on this column here. And this column, company ID, is going to reference the company's company ID. And that's it. This adds the foreign key for you. Execute that. It was successful, which is great. Now I just want to show you, now that we added the foreign key to the employees table, if I refresh the columns here, keep an eye on this icon here next to this company ID column. I'm going to refresh it. Notice that now there's a different key icon here. In SQL Management Studio, if you have a foreign key, it'll show you that you have a foreign key using this hollow key. The solid key is a primary key, the hollow key is a foreign key. So now that we have all the data, let's run our join, our select statement again, where we're joining employees and companies by company ID. And we see we have John Doe, right? The John employee record linked to company. And it works because company 1 exists and John exists in the employee table. So now let's go into the companies table and delete the company 1. And we're going to click yes. Do you want to delete the row? Yes. And here's the error that you get. You get a delete statement conflicted with a reference constraint foreign key employees company. And all this basically is a way to prevent you from creating orphan records in SQL Server. Thank you guys. That's it for now. In the next video, we'll go a little more into the different types of joins. Thanks for watching.